We are, of course, at a remarkable juncture in terms of how we deal with space going forward. And we have to acknowledge that space is ubiquitous. We all understand, and we heard from amazing people this morning about how space is so important to our everyday lives. It's important to everybody's life, in industrialised countries, in non-industrialised countries, around the world. It's important in so many ways, from agricultural management and disaster management to weather forecasting, to navigation services, to communications, and the list goes on and on and on. So space is ubiquitous. And in that context, it's important to recognise that we need to have a framework, because space, as well as being ubiquitous, is highly complex. If you think about what space is, it's strategic, and as we've heard, it's commercial, and it's civil, and it's cultural, and it's scientific, and sadly, it's militarised. And the overarching is it's about humanity, past, present, and future. And in all of that context, we need to understand rules of the road. Those rules of the road are what I'll take you through in 2 minutes, because I really want to end up on my final PowerPoint, which is where do we go from here? What are the challenges? So hopefully this works. It does. This, I don't know whether you can read that, but I have to make this point. It says, what does it say? Space is not a lawless domain. So you will hear from time to time references to, and it just cringes the hairs on the back of my head, the wild, wild west. And the law is outdated and outmoded and we have to start again, and people can do whatever they want in space. Please believe me when I say that's not the case. So we've had a whole series of phases. I apologise, lots of words, but just to demonstrate phases of lawmaking. So after Sputnik, international law has to react to this technology, and it does. Out of that, a UN process is devised. Out of that UN process, we have a series of fundamental treaties in the 60s and 70s. Yes, it's a long time ago. But so were the Geneva Conventions on the Laws of War, 1949, and they are still powerfully applicable to how wars are conducted today. So I don't accept from those who perhaps should know better saying, well, because this is old, technologies move forward, we have to ignore these laws and move on. These laws have set out incredibly fundamental principles. And sure, it's geopolitics at play in a lot of what we do, but I think the point to be made is that, by and large, notwithstanding how the technology has raced forward, space works. Space works well. Sure, there are many issues, and I will come to the challenges, but space works well. We haven't had conflict in space. We've done remarkable things. The international community in every country, their lifestyles, their standards of living have been raised significantly by the fact that we've been able to access space. And indeed, studies have been done about a day without space and what a disaster that would be. Not just for the military, although for them it would be a disaster because the military is so reliant on space assets, but for all of us. So space is everywhere. There is a lot of law. There are these treaties that exist. They still apply fundamental principles that guide us all. For geopolitical reasons, and that really is about how does one share in these benefits that we can garner from space. Very difficult philosophical, ideological and nationalistic questions, because we categorise space from a legal perspective as an area what we call beyond national jurisdiction. So Australian law does not apply to space. It might apply to space objects, just like Australian law would apply to ships on the high seas or aeroplanes. But Australian law, no national law applies to space. It's governed as an area beyond national jurisdiction. There is an international regime of international law. And that, of course, requires agreement not by one or two, but by many countries. And of course, there are compromises all the way. The UN system is absolutely no way perfect. And I have the privilege of representing Australia at the UN, and I've now been honoured with chairing UN discussions on how we move forward on resource exploitation. So I know that it's a frustrating, but in the end, rewarding, and indeed the only way forward is in the way we manage space is to find a consensus path. And I know there are some people in the room who are cynical about that, but in the end, space is so important to all of us that it's very, very scary if we start thinking that one or two or three companies, let alone countries, can begin to do whatever they want. That is not the case, notwithstanding loud voices that you hear often. So, space is multifaceted from a legal perspective. Again, I won't bore you, but there are these treaties, there are a series of national laws. We've heard reference to the Australian national law. I had the privilege of reviewing that law, which led up to the changes, and I'm working with 4 or 5 other governments on their laws. National law is important. I'm focusing here more on the international framework, because it's that international framework that really informs the way we divide and design national law and the obligations that countries like Australia have. And the point to make is that Australia is a party to all of the treaties. Australia sees itself as a responsible space citizen. Of course, we have strategic alliances. Of course, we have the ability to do a whole range of technological industrial things. But we also have a responsibility as a responsible international citizen to help drive the discussions forward in a path that leads to, and this is the mantra at the UN, the sustainability, safety and security of space. They are the important things. So there are many other aspects of law that might be weaved in. I mentioned some of these fundamental principles, and if anyone would like a copy of these slides, of course I can make them available. I apologise for all the words, but I think the depth of the words gives an idea that hopefully there's some substance behind what I'm saying. The Outer Space Treaty, which was the first of these treaties, we celebrated an anniversary of it not so long ago. The 50th anniversary of the Outer Space Treaty, sets these principles that guide the way we work forward. Again, an analogy is think of the Geneva Conventions and the Protocols for War, think of the Law of the Sea Convention on Sea, think of the Outer Space Treaty for Space. These principles that revolve around peace and cooperation and responsibility for actions and doing things with responsibility have guided us and work very well. So I don't want to sound too Pollyannish because, of course, things have changed. And because the technology is continually moving forward, and of course law will never keep up in any area where technology moves forward very quickly, obviously law cannot keep up. And in the space arena, law should not keep up because the technology is constantly changing. And you know how difficult it is to change law. And once you change law, it's going to sit there for 10 or 20 years. I mean, look at our Space Activities Act. It took upwards of 20 years to change that. And so we should obviously try to be cognizant and supplement these fundamental principles with specifics about particular types of things we do in space, but we can never be totally up to date. So what are the challenges? Well, one of the challenges, and this is the last slide, one of the challenges about the way we look at space is to look at it in a holistic way. Governments don't look at space necessarily in a holistic way, although the Australian government has changed. But when I was asked in 2015 to review the Space Activities Act, I had the privilege of talking to 6 or 7 government departments, and it was really informative for me to see that defence thought about space in a different way from industry, in a different way from finance, in a different way from DFAT, and the list goes on. So even within one country, You need to form a holistic way of looking about what space is. And I think in the last few years, the Australian government has done, if I may say, a really good job in trying to bring that together and focusing it around CSIRO and the agency. But when you've got 193 countries looking at space, they will all have different perspectives of what space is. And, you know, it leads to interesting arguments. So the technology has moved forward. And there are many challenges for us now. The fundamental principles I mentioned apply, they apply well, but clearly they're in generalities, not in specifics. So what are the major challenges? Well, we've heard a lot of discussion about debris. And if I may say, all of these issues, except for the last one, are being discussed at the UN regularly through the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and at the Conference of Disarmament when it comes to some of the military stuff. So, the sustainability of space debris, a major concern. There was a question about how are we going to declutter. Excellent question, difficult answers. So we need to work that through. Not only technologically, of course, that's the challenge, but there are many legal issues. The militarisation of space, I've already said that militaries are very dependent on space. We can't help that. But what we have to try to avoid is the ratcheting up to move to what is referred to as a weaponisation of space. And for 40 years now, the UN and other bodies have been passing resolutions called PAROS, Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. And that's a powerful movement. Some of the discussions you hear from some politicians around the world fill us with a bit of dread on this issue, but we have to work hard. Small satellite technology, we're going to have, at the moment we have functioning in space, perhaps, I don't know what the number is, maybe 2,500 functioning satellites, all shapes and sizes. SpaceX themselves want to put up 40,000. So you can see, notwithstanding they might be in lower Earth orbits, the exponential growth of the amount of objects we put in space, which obviously has debris implications. We need to deal with that, legal issues. We've got a whole range of other issues. I won't go on because Donna's looking at me rather anxiously. But all of these issues are important. And I put there also, when we think about space, because we don't define where space begins, it's a fundamental question. And there's political reasons for that. But there's this area below space, but perhaps above commercial space, which we call high altitude, that we're also beginning to look at now. So all of these questions need to be looked at. What, for me, are the two fundamental takeaways about how we engage in this process? And you'll hear, no doubt, from my fellow speakers about ethical concerns. Well, for me, space is about humanity, notwithstanding all the other things it is as well. And the future of humanity, whether or not you agree with Stephen Hawking that we actually need to live off Earth as a humanity, but the future of humanity is inextricably tied to our ability to continually access space, but also access it in a responsible way. If we can do 500 things in space now, we need to understand, perhaps, and prioritise, well, what are the 300 that we should be doing? And that's a difficult issue, and we haven't got the criteria to work that out. I'm sure our ethicists will tell us. The last point there I think is important. In the end, notwithstanding all of the incredible benefits that everybody gets from space from a commercial and other perspective, we are all, in a sense, stewards and custodians, just like the land on Earth. And I think in the end, it will be in the common interests of all states who, in the end, whilst they're competitive, understand that we all rely and require access to space, to recognise that there are certain lines that cannot be crossed. Law will help us, but law cannot necessarily change decisions if people want to engage in irresponsible behaviour. And law is all about shaping responsible behaviour, notwithstanding that, obviously, there are different perspectives. I'm sorry I've gone slightly over time, Donna. Thank you so much.